Hi, welcome to Education Amplifier's last webinar of the 2017-2018 school year. My name is Maribel Gonzalez, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to host this digital space to share information that will help you all connect the powerful message of the Power to the Polls campaign to the content you're sharing in your classrooms and the conversations you are having in your community around the 2018 midterms. And so this is what to expect with our webinar this afternoon. And so first, I'm going to share a little bit about our Education Amplifier program and ways that you can participate in the next school year. Bob Bland from Women's March is going to join us to share information about the campaign, Power to the Polls. Melissa Wyatt from Rock the Vote has joined us to share information about activating young people to vote. And then lastly, a featured artist, Rochelle Zuasso, in Power to the Polls, is going to share with us about her experiences and what led her to create artwork to share with the world. And then, of course, we're going to have opportunity for Q&A and discussion at the very end. And so before we get started, I want to share a little bit of housekeeping. Okay, so on your control panel, you'll notice a section that's titled Chat. So during presentations from our panelists, you'll have a chance to type in a question for the short Q&A afterwards. So please remember to send to organizers and panelists only so that I can take a look at it, and we'll only have time for a few questions. But you can email me at maribel@amplifier.org. That's M-A-R-I-B as in boy, E-L, if you have any pressing questions or concerns. So again, on your control panel, you should see a selection that says chat, and then you can type in your question. So we're going to let our panelists share, and then afterwards we'll have time for 5 minutes for some questions. And so a little bit about our education program. So Amplifier is a design lab committed to amplifying the voices of social change movements through art and community engagement. The Education Amplifier program works to amplify the voices of social change movements by creating meaningful ways for K-12 educators and students to engage with art from our campaigns. So the program provides an opportunity for community-rooted engagement by bringing Amplifiers art as well as lesson plans, resources about social justice issues into classrooms across the country. You can register to be a part of our 2018-2019 cohort by going to education.amplifier.org, and you'll have access to our digital learning space on Edmodo with resources for your classroom, free artwork delivered to your classroom, an online course, and monthly curriculum created by a community of change makers. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, I would like to introduce our first panelist, and her name is Bob Bland, and she's one of the national co-chairs of the Women's March on Washington. On January 21st, 2017, the Women's March on Washington became the largest mass mobilization in U.S. history, with over 5 million marching worldwide. Bob serves as co-president and board member of Women's March, whose mission is to harness the political power of diverse women and their communities to create transformative social change. Women's March continues as a movement of nonviolent resistance, committed to dismantling systems of oppression and building inclusive structures guided by self-determination, dignity, and respect. And so Power to the Polls is a traveling art exhibition and national voter registration drive. A 12-person curatorial team reviewed over 3,000 submissions and selected 50 artworks meant to energize swing state voters, inspiring them to take to the polls and elect leaders who reflect American majority values. So the goal was to register 1 million new voters. I'd like to welcome Bob. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have access to video, you can go ahead and select the video icon. Awesome. Okay, great. I can see you. All right. So thank you again for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule since you've been working hard with the Power to the Polls campaign. Can you share more about the campaign with our educators?
Yeah, absolutely. So On January 21st, 2018, Women's March gathered in Las Vegas, Nevada to launch Power to the Polls, which is a national voter registration tour 1 year after the historic Women's March on Washington. And the reason why we signified that date is because we believe that converting the power of feet on the streets to power at the polls is the critical next stage of this movement. So this entire year, we've been channeling the energy and activism of the Women's March into tangible strategies to create electoral change in 2018. The national voter registration part of the tour is targeting key states that we know that we need to register new voters, engage impacted communities, and harness our collective energy to empower grassroots leaders to advocate for policies and elect candidates that reflect the values we marched under, which are the Women's March Unity Principles. If you want a refresher on the Women's March Unity Principles, you can take a look at womensmarch.com/principles and take a look at why we marched in the first place and what we believe in and the type of change that we're looking to seek. So we're collaborating with partners like Amplifier to promote more opportunities for progressive women to run for office and diverse candidates that truly reflect the face of their communities in leadership. The campaign was built on the Women's March's ongoing work uplifting the voices and campaigns of the nation's most marginalized communities, and always with our goal of creating transformative social and political change. What we've seen this year so far, we've done about 6 tour stops so far on our national tour. So we have visited states like North Carolina, California, and other key states that we know are pivotal for winning in the 2018 midterm elections. And we've been bringing Amplifier art along with us because we believe that if the art of the movement is strong, then the entire movement is going to be strong, and that the cultural portion of Power to the Polls is as important as the electoral strategy, because what we see when people are depressed, when they don't feel like they can really make a difference in their government and in their world, they don't vote. And so we're facing a few different things when we commit to fighting systemic voter suppression laws, gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and all the other different ways that people are suppressed from coming to the polls, and that prevent so many, especially marginalized communities, from voting. We already have seen in many primaries this year that women are the leaders we've been waiting for, and women are winning a lot of their races, both at the primaries and the general elections, women who reflect why we marched on January 21st and why we continue to fight. As we've just even seen this week with the separation of children at the border and the ending of amnesty for women who have been victims of domestic violence at our border. This is a pivotal fight. We have no choice. We must continue to resist hateful policies and discrimination and systemic white supremacy, racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia. And we need to be willing to put our full hearts into this movement. And it all has to do with the polls, because, you know, one thing we all need to recognize is that voting is a privilege. Not everybody has the right to vote in this country that needs to be represented. So through the art of Amplifier and through all of our work together on our national tour, on our voter registration campaign, and every different way that we're pushing people to take their power to the polls, we want to make sure that they feel the emotional pull of the art, the way that art brings communities together, and that we create and sustain this powerful movement so that this year the midterm elections can have more of a movement vote, something where people feel like they're really not just voting for themselves and their family, but for everyone that we marched for on January 21st. And now I believe that you have some questions for me, so I'd love to take some questions about Power to the Polls, and then also in general about the work of Women's March and the Amplifier campaign.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. So you mentioned that one of the goals of Women's March in collaboration with your partners is to promote more opportunities for progressive women candidates to run for office. Have you seen a growth in women running for office since 2017?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we've seen is one of our partners, Emily's List, for instance, has said that since the Women's March, they have gone from, in 2016, for instance, they had 400 women who signed up who were interested to run for office. And then the following year after the Women's Marches in 2017, they had 40,000 women sign up just in 1 year alone, saying that they were interested in running for office. We've seen so many different types of programs come up, from Emerge to Ignite. There's so many different training programs. Specifically, there's even one specifically just for campaign managers. So we're not just looking at women running for office, we're also seeing women help women run for office. And what we're also seeing is that there are now an unprecedented amount of women running for office at the state, local, and national level. So this is not just a phenomenon for people running for office in congressional districts, but also for everything from sheriff to district attorney to their school boards. Women are rising up and saying, we are the leaders we've been waiting for.
It's amazing. 400 women to 40,000 women in 1 year interested in running for office. That's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. So the last question for this presentation is, how can we inspire young people, young women, young femmes, young people of color, people that are in marginalized communities that where, historically have not been able to vote, to get civically engaged, meaning vote and run for office?
Yeah, so we have an incredible group of young people known as Women's March Youth Empower, which was rooted in our Youth Ambassador program that brought youth to represent all 50 states to the Women's March in 2017 when we originally launched, and is led by an incredible youth coordinator, Tabitha St. Bernard, who has been with us organizing as a national organizer with the Women's March since the very beginning. The Youth Empower group, which is all student-led, it's mostly high school and college students, many who, again, have been with us since the very beginning of Women's March, and some who have joined us more recently, created a voter registration toolkit in September of 2017, prior to our Women's Convention, which was a historic convening of over 5,000 women from across the nation in Detroit, Michigan in October of 2017. And so since September of last year, Youth Empower has been registering youth to vote and also educating them about when they can register to vote, regardless of which age they are, depending on what state they are in. And then we have also been mobilizing with even more youth since our March 14th student walkouts that happened across the nation, where we had at least 2 million students across the nation walking out of their schools on March 14th to protest gun violence. And it's been a time that we've really seen a lot more energy from youth this spring and summer, but particularly when it comes to the culture, when it comes to the art, we've been seeing that from young people the entire time. So we just encourage anyone who's interested in getting involved with Youth Empower or starting a Youth Empower chapter in their community to go to the microsite for Youth Empower, which is just youthempower.com. and you can see how to join the youth community of students. You can start a Youth Empower chapter in your own area, and you can also learn more about the Empower Coalition, which is a new coalition of organizations coming together with the united purpose of supporting and strengthening the youth movement here in the United States to enact change this year in the midterm elections. So check that out.
Awesome. So definitely educators in classrooms have this amazing opportunity to shift culture. So yes, you're not allowed to vote. There's certain conditions that require you to vote, and young people cannot vote, but we can start the conversations now. We can have dialogue with children, and so we're shifting that culture to get them civically engaged so that when they're able to vote, it's already set in place, right? So what I'm hearing you say is that educators who are interested in getting students excited about becoming civically engaged, that they can go to youthempower.com. And I put the link here in the chat on your control panel, as well as connect with Empower Coalition. And this is support network for students who are interested in activating energy from their campus and their communities and forming a coalition to get involved in civic engagement. Awesome.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much for joining us, Bob, and sharing all of the information about Power to the Polls. Where can educators connect with Women's March and Power to the Polls if they want to share the visuals, if they want to connect with this campaign in their communities?
Yeah, so you can go to powertothepolls.com for more information, and we put all of our different actions and events. So again, we have a national tour, but we're also going to be sending out soon a new kit for anyone to create a voter registration event within their community. And so I think that if you just sign on to any of our mailing lists, whether it's Youth Empower, if you're a student, or whether it's through Power to the Polls, or even just on the regular womensmarch.com website, we're going to be launching a kit so that this summer, with us all having barbecues and having pool parties and all these different really great fun summer times, that it's also a perfect time. If you've ever put together a yard sale, then you can put together a voter registration event. And we're going to be providing a toolkit with all the support that you need to do that in your community and really take advantage of the diverse range of communities across this nation and make sure that we're making every vote count.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to go ahead and introduce our next panelist. Thank you, Bob, for joining us.
Thank you.
Here. All right. So Melissa Wyatt is Rock the Vote's policy associate, where she contributes to policy work surrounding voting rights and election administration. Melissa leads the research and development of reports on youth voting and supports the Rock the Vote participation and technology program.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be part of today's Power at the Polls webinar. At Rock the Vote, we're always so glad to work with Amplifier, and we're really proud to be engaged in Power to the Polls through powering the online voter registration tool of the Women's March and engaging in a variety of other ways. We're also really proud to be a part of the Youth Empower Coalition. So today, I'm really excited to talk to you all about activating young people to vote around the 2018 midterms and beyond. So before I get started, I'm not sure, are we able to ask questions?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So there were just a couple of questions that I wanted to put at the top of mind before I started talking about all of the ways that you can engage young people around voting. And so first off, I was wondering if you all have helped your students register to vote before, or if you all have discussed civic engagement with your students before. Oh, yay! 100%. I love to see that. That's fantastic. Okay, great. So I'm really glad that many of you have registered your students to vote before and talked to them about how important civic engagement can be in all of its forms. And so today I wanted to share some of Rock the Vote's lessons learned and our best practices that we've developed on how to engage young people in our elections and in our democracy, so that hopefully the next time that you're talking to your students about civic engagement, you can kind of have these tips in your back pocket and work to impact your students as much as possible when kind of talking about voting and our democracy. So a little bit of background about what Rock the Vote is. Our organization was founded almost 30 years ago, and our mission boils down to one key point, which is building political power for young people and empowering them to participate in democracy. And so we have done this in a variety of ways. We've worked to pass legislation to increase access to the polls. We've built campaigns that fuse pop culture and music and politics, and created the technology to register and turn out millions of voters nationwide. One thing that we've also done is we've studied and tested what motivates young people to vote and where there are gaps in education and information that young people really need to be able to turn out and feel empowered and informed when they cast a ballot. And so years ago, this led us to develop Democracy Class, which is a civics education program and curriculum to help teach students about the history of voting, how they can navigate the voting process if and when they're eligible, and the reasons why it's so important to participate in any way that you can. And so we're excited to share that we're relaunching Democracy Class this year so that it's more reflective of what young people look like today, and so that it's inclusive of everyone and makes sure that in the civic engagement space, everyone feels equally welcome and that we're aligned with this increasingly diverse youth generation. So without further ado, I wanted to get started and dive into our best practices for activating young people to vote. And so the number one thing that we've learned in our work at Rock the Vote is when you're talking to young people about voting, the number one way to get their buy-in is connecting the issues to voting. And so when we are talking to young people about why they should participate in our democracy, a lot of the things that we have found really successful are carving out space to talk to people about how voting is a way for us to claim our power, and how as young people we do represent the largest, most diverse generation in our nation's history, and we are this year becoming the biggest voting bloc in history. And so if we do turn out, we really can create positive impacts both nationwide, statewide, and in our local communities. And so voting is something that connects to every issue that we care about. And I feel like that's something that in the past really hasn't been spoken to enough. But the reality is that our elected officials are the people who, at every level of government, are given the power to take action and create change in the different issue areas that we care about. And so voting is the key, no matter what you're invested in, to have a say in what you want the future to look like and making your voice heard on the direction that you want your community to head. And you have the power to elect officials who will represent your values and advocate for the issues that you care about. And so kind of starting with that framework is what we've always found to be effective, especially as young people have kind of changed as the years have gone on. And so a couple other things that I think are really interesting to drive home when talking about how important voting at all levels of government is the fact that things that we take for granted at the national level today, things like minimum wage and women's suffrage, in marriage equality and basic environmental protections, are all policies that began at the local level. And so sometimes when the federal government isn't necessarily being responsive to the issues that we care about, we found that it can be really effective to talk about the ways that local and state offices can both impact our day-to-day lives now and create that ripple effect in those issue areas that we care about to affect the entire nation as the years go on. And so I think that this is especially salient today, considering that young people are dealing with so many issues like gun violence in schools and communities and immigration reform. The fact that sexual assault is a real and pressing issue that 1 in 4 young women are going to experience in their lifetime, dealing with the prospect of student loan debt, and the fact that people of color are really likely to be killed by law enforcement than other demographics. And so this is really important and heavy stuff. And presenting voting as the key and creating a link between voting and these really heavy issue areas can be really effective when explaining the present day significance of why, if you're eligible, you should cast a ballot. And so in advocacy, I feel like there are so many tools in your toolbox, and voting is one of them. And just presenting it as an option where if you are eligible, it's something that you can't leave behind if you're trying to make a difference can be really effective. And so after creating those links about how voting connects to all these issue areas, I think it's also really critical to demystify the process for young people. And something that we think about all the time at Rock the Vote is the fact that the voting process can be really confusing. And for those of us who've been participating in a few cycles, it's easy to forget like just how much this terminology might not make sense when you're becoming a participant in our democracy for the first time and when you're eligible to vote for the first time. So making sure to address things like what's an absentee ballot can be really critical, because a lot of this stuff isn't really explained in other spaces to young people, and this might be the first time that they're encountering this information. A lot of times we get questions from people asking, do they have to register to vote a separate time for every single election? And that isn't the case as long as you have an active and ongoing voter registration. And so kind of clearing up things like that, talking about what voter ID might mean in your state or when the next election is, can be kind of the next key link to starting to move people towards participation. And whether your students are of voting age or not, I think that it's really helpful to establish these links at an early age and drive home not only why civic engagement is important, but the actual mechanics of how you participate, so that when someone goes to the voting booth for the first time or when they're encouraging others in their community to vote, they kind of understand what all these terms mean and understand how to participate. So especially if your students aren't quite old enough to vote, one thing that I think can be really fun to bring to your classroom is doing a voting demo or a mock election in your classroom and having people register to vote, having them practice what it's like to vote early or cast an absentee ballot, and going through what they would need to do and bring to their precinct on election day can be a really effective hands-on way to kind of drive these points home and make it a little bit more tangible for them. And so a fun example of why I think that this is so important for demystifying the process is when I was back in high school, I lived in Florida, and I was eligible for pre-registration when I turned 16. I didn't even know what that word meant, and I never would have known until my senior class had a civic education class where someone came in from the Board of Elections and actually got us pre-registered and walked us through what all this terminology meant. And I would have gone years having no idea what that was. I didn't understand what early voting meant. And so kind of thinking about where I initially started with civic education to where I am today, I think that kind of presenting these things to your students can be really effective and clear up misinformation about the voting process. And so one statistic that I wanted to pull out before I move on to our next best practice is there was a recent study that we found that 75% of young people thought that they needed a current government photo ID to vote and that they would not be able to cast a ballot without one. And there are many states that do have strict voter ID laws, but the majority of the young people who were participating in this poll actually lived in states that didn't have voter ID laws. And so by demystifying the process and really walking young people through what it means to cast a ballot and how they can do so, it can clear up that misinformation and make sure that they're really prepared to cast a ballot. And so this also leads into our third best practice, which is empowering young people with information. And so at this point, hopefully you've been able to drive home why the issues that young people already care about tie into voting and the mechanics of how they cast a ballot. And I think that the next best step is talking to them about what exactly is going on in elections this year and in 2020 and in the next few cycles and what this means. So 36% of states are electing new governors in 2018, and almost 9 in 10 state legislatures are having elections. And I don't think this is being talked about enough. And I'm sure we all know that every seat in the U.S. House of Representatives is up for election this year, as well as a third of the Senate and countless ballot measures and local initiatives and local offices as well. And so I think that empowering young people with the information on which races are happening can also be really effective. And also when we're talking about these kind of abstract things about like state legislatures, breaking down, well, what does this mean? And what do the people who are elected to the state legislature even do? And so by kind of boiling these things down, it can allow you to show how elected officials at the local, state, and federal level have that real impact in our everyday lives. And so kind of pairing that with like what these offices are that they might be voting on, I think that you can also add in the important dates and deadlines for upcoming elections so that now that they know how to participate, they'll also know the deadlines in which to do so that they don't accidentally miss a registration deadline, or if they need an absentee ballot, know when they need to request one by. So I think that all of these things are really kind of important pieces of the puzzle when educating people about the voting process and how they can participate. And I did touch on this a couple of minutes ago, but one thing that I think is really great when talking to people who aren't quite of voting age yet is talking about pre-registration if it's available in your state. And so what pre-registration is, it means that people who aren't 18 yet can submit a voter registration form. And in some states, you can do this at as early as 16 years old and have the registration processed and ready to go on their 18th birthday. And so, again, if you're working with students who aren't yet able to vote, walking them through those options can be a really great thing, because if you're working with high schoolers and you're able to pre-register them on the spot, then it just helps loop them seamlessly into the process and make sure that they're ready to participate, even if they're not in your classroom when they do turn 18 and are ready to vote. And so the fifth and last best practice that I wanted to talk about today is creating FOMO, the fear of missing out. And so now that we've, again, gone through why the issues matter and how you participate and what all of these different pieces mean in elections, one thing that we found in just the past couple of years to be really effective is driving home the identity of being a voter. And when talking about voting to those who are eligible, kind of framing voting in a positive, empowering light and talking about the fact that everyone else is voting. And so kind of framing it as a group activity that you want to be a part of can be really effective in talking about how if you're eligible to vote, you don't want to be left out. So when creating FOMO, I think that it's great to touch on how voting is not just a way for you to stand up for what you want and need, but also a way for you to stand up and be a voice for your community at large. And so if you're able to vote and you choose not to, someone else is going to make decisions on these issues for you. If you choose not to use your voice when you're eligible, then you're letting someone else speak for you. And so when talking to eligible voters, I think it's also important to drive home that we owe it to our communities when we're eligible to vote to exercise that right for those who can't. And so maybe your students know people who are not old enough to vote, and maybe you live in a state where there are still archaic laws that prevent people with past convictions or disabilities from fully participating in our democracy. Or maybe they know people who aren't U.S. citizens in their community. And I think that it's really important to drive home that if you are lucky enough to have the right to vote, that's really, really powerful. And you need to cast a ballot not just for yourself, but for the people who you know that can't, and for others in your community. And so I think that that's a really important piece when kind of creating the FOMO, is talking about how it's not just for you, but it's for everyone that you know, and how you can really give those people and those issues a platform, and how everyone else who's eligible is going to be making their voice heard, and you don't want to let your voice be left out if you're able to exercise that right. So those were the 5 best practices that I wanted to talk to you all about today. And to wrap things up, I wanted to just drive home that the numbers show that educators really have an impact. And that recent study that I was mentioning about young people maybe not having the right information about voter ID or the other mechanics of voting, there was another conclusion that found that 2/3 of young people got their voting information from people in their day-to-day lives, people like you, and less than 20% of young people learned about voting from civic engagement organizations like Rock the Vote. And so obviously there's a huge disparity, and I think that this shows, more than 3 times the amount of young people were getting their voting information from educators and family members and friends, and a smaller proportion were getting them from organizations like us. And so we have been able to kind of hone in on these best practices and what works throughout the years about motivating young people to vote, but I think that you all really have a tremendous potential for impact, much more than a lot of other organizations and people. And so I just wanted to talk about the results of that survey, because I thought it was super interesting and kind of, again, drove home why it's so important to bring civic engagement education to the classroom and talking about the voting process, because your students really do respond to what you say. The studies show it. So before I wrap up, I wanted to also let you all know about a nationwide day of action to register voters that is going to be happening during the fall. And so it's called National Voter Registration Day, and it's happening on September 25th this year. And it is designed to take place before each state's voter registration deadlines before the November general election, so that no matter where you are in the country, everyone who you're registering will still be able to participate and make the deadlines for November. And so at Rock the Vote, we were lucky enough to be a premier partner of last year's National Voter Registration Day. And even in 2017, where there weren't any major nationwide federal elections, there were still almost 3,000 partners who participated, and we registered almost 125,000 voters throughout the country on that single day. And since National Voter Registration Day began in 2012, over 1.6 million voters in the U.S. have been registered on that single day. And so as we re-release Democracy Class so that it better reflects the values of young people today this fall, we would also love to have you share it with your students on and around National Voter Registration Day. And if you're able, channel that energy into registering your students and helping them turn out in the midterms. So those were all the things that I wanted to talk about today. I realized that that might have been a lot, but if you all have any questions, we have a lot of resources available on rockthevote.org, including an online voter registration tool. We also have toolkits that can help you do in-person, on-the-ground registration if you had any questions about how you might do this with your students. And we would love to have you use Democracy Class in the fall and, again, participate in National Voter Registration Day. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that really fabulous, useful information. And so I know you answered this question and with all of the information that you shared, but I wanted to see if you had a succinct answer for this. This is something that I get all of the time as an educator and in my community is, what would you tell a young person or an adult even who doesn't believe their vote matters?
It absolutely does. Oh man, I mean, this isn't going to always happen for every voter, but every single year there are elections in this country that are decided by one vote. I want to say it was in 2014 in Ohio, there were 7 elections in one day that were decided by just one voter. And obviously that's not always going to happen for everyone, but I do think that it drives home that every vote really does matter. And even in races that might not be so close, it's so important to make your voice heard because elected officials are most responsive to voters. And so if you are trying to advocate for an issue that you care about and you're able to point to your strong voting record, elected officials really do respond to that, even when it's not election day. And if no one votes, then there will be no progress. And so you absolutely have to turn out if you have the right. And it's even better if you can take like 4 or 5 of your friends with you, because the road to change can sometimes be long, but we absolutely have to turn out if we can. And voting again is one of the many tools in our advocacy toolbox, but when we're trying to make change, like, we can't leave one of our tools behind. And that's kind of how I feel about voting.
That's amazing. So I just wanted to reiterate to our educators, just like Melissa shared, it is about empowering youth with information. So when sharing this information with youth, it doesn't necessarily need to be presented in the form of a lesson plan. So sharing basic information about voting to youth is really helpful because, one, they can share this information with their families, and then they'll hopefully remember it as adults, especially if it's something that they're hearing every year. So thank you, Melissa, for joining us. I'm excited to introduce our next panelist. Rachel Duazo is a queer femme Filipina American visual artist from the Pacific Northwest. Artistically, her specialties include portraits, comics, and typography. Her work focuses on themes of love, heartbreak, loss, memory, identity, and place. Rachel's art is part of the traveling art exhibition, as you can see here. It says, "My voice will be heard, I will not be silenced." Rachel, are you on the call?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to hear about your perspective and about your message that you have with the world, that you like to share with the world. So the first question I like to ask is, how do you navigate the expectations of voting in the U.S. versus the reality of voting for folks of color?
I think by default, there's this really enduring stereotype of younger people and people of color as well, that we don't care, that we're not invested in social justice, and that we're especially not well versed in everything that's going on in the world. I think a lot of people tend to expect apathy from us. And I think now more than ever, because of how easily we can access knowledge online, through the news, through social media, within our community, knowledge around voting is so much more accessible and available to us. And the effort we put into just knowing what's going on in the world really predisposes us to be more active in voting and policy reform. But for people of color, I feel like there's this added layer of being exposed to racism. And personally, that's when I get really hyper aware and self-conscious of people thinking that I'm pushing a really specific agenda because I am a person of color. And I guess truthfully, you could say that I do have a certain agenda because there's always going to be really specific issues that are different per group.
That's so interesting that you say that, that there's a specific agenda, because we're sharing this knowledge and we're sharing this message with these values of tolerance and compassion, and those values are reflected in anti-racism, right, in that work.
Right.
And so it is an agenda. It's an agenda that's pro-human, right? That's pro-compassion and pro-tolerance. It's a message of my voice will be heard, right? Regardless of these layers, regardless of these systems. So it's really powerful. So how does your experience voting influence how you create artwork with a message?
I think whether I'm voting for a candidate or making a decision on whether or not I'm for or against a specific issue, I always want to consider the audience that I'm creating art for. And the audience that's going to be basically most emotionally affected by the work that I'm creating. And sometimes I find that those two audiences aren't always necessarily the same groups of people, which surprises folks. And going back to what I said about doing work that's like really specific to people of color, I want to create work that represents marginalized groups that don't have a lot of visibility in mainstream culture. So it feels especially important that I create work that clearly and visually depicts Black, Indigenous people of color, queer and or trans people, women identifying people, disabled people, people with mental illness, etc. Basically anyone who has been made voiceless in the past. Like I want to create work that specifically brings them into the spotlight.
Awesome. So representation matters, and that seems like
yes, that hashtag.
Yes, and you know, personally myself, as a Chicana, when I see not even just Chicanos or Mexican American identified folks or Latinx folks represented in artwork, but when I see Black women, when I see all women, people of color represented in the artwork, I'm connected because of our shared history of oppression. And I definitely feel really connected to your artwork, and I feel like I am part of a community that's actively making change. And at the very least way that we can do that is to encourage people to vote and inspire people to vote for women elected candidates and just voting for issues that we care about. Absolutely. So how do you hope youth, so this artwork, you know, it's a traveling art exhibition. It's in communities all over the U.S., but specifically in our education program, youth are accessing this artwork and they're seeing all of these wonderful messages and all of these different communities being represented. And so speaking specifically on your artwork and your specific art piece, how do you hope youth will interpret this as they seek to create positive change in their communities?
I definitely agree with what you just said, you know, that it doesn't have to be specifically us that we see in the work. It could be Black women, it could be women in general. Because like when I was younger, I was always like aching for a role model and like looking really, really desperately for reflections of myself in mainstream media, right? And I think that goes, you know, it's the same for a lot of marginalized people across the board. Like you can't find people who look like you. And as a queer Filipino woman who's an adult now, I still find myself like doing that same searching, you know, for ways like my identities can be shared with the world and how that's how I see myself in media. And now that I have a sufficient amount of social capital as a really visible visual artist, I feel really compelled to reach out to youth, especially, and to show them that someone like me who grew from being a really insecure, confused child into someone who's really passionate about self-expression and representation can evolve in their artistic process over time and create real change with their art. And I think when you grow up without a hero, you have to become your own hero eventually so that other people can believe in themselves too.
Awesome. And so I know you may have you touched on this a little bit, but for our educators who are in this wonderful opportunity to shift culture and to create dialogue and create another world that is compassionate and tolerant and accepting. And I really feel that having those conversations in the classroom is going to extend beyond the classroom into our communities and into our society, and it's going to create new norms of being and relating to one another. And so we talked about how representation matters and the effects of being ourselves And so I want to challenge you and what would the world look like? Or what are the effects of seeing your culture identity experience? So we're living in a world now where representation does matter. So what would that world look like, especially for young gender non-conforming folks or women identifying folks? What would that world be like if we were represented in an equitable way?
I have said this before, but I think specifically women have been written off as emotional, sensitive, weak, crazy, and then too much. And a lot of that has really barred women specifically from succeeding in a lot of different fields, including art. And I do think as a woman who creates, I want to celebrate the idea of being too much and inspire and motivate other women to speak. And being queer and a woman of color who practices gender fluidity, there is so much that people don't understand or misunderstand about myself, about queerness, the queer community, social justice issues that are really, really specific to this identity, and how so many of the different isms and phobias like racism, transphobia, misogyny, etc., really intersect in one person. And I think if people were to be introduced to that kind of person in their work and all that comes with that, this very specific identity, they would become more compassionate and loving towards other people. And that's really the goal, right? And that would open up a lot of doors for other people who don't conform to, gender roles, people who are treated differently because of how they present themselves. If we specifically share our work with the world, I do think we could build a lot of mutual understanding, love, and community. And I think the opposite of that, not having that understanding, love, and community, it does come from a lot of ignorance and not knowing what people are about. So I think allowing the world to get to know us through our art is what's really important.
That's powerful. And so creating artwork and sharing it with the world then has been, what experience has that been like for you to put yourself out there like that? Because you mentioned earlier that, you're creating your own pathway, right? That you didn't have models and representations of yourself. So you're carving this path for yourself so that other people can be inspired. And so what has that been like for you?
When I first started sharing my work on Instagram specifically, I truly did not feel that people saw me for who I was. And I thought I actually really thought it wasn't valuable. Especially when you're first starting off, like sharing yourself and there isn't a lot of traction and you don't get a lot of representation, you think, oh, okay, people aren't being receptive to this. People don't care. And it's been a really interesting process of unfolding and opening up where, I remember my first workshop that I did. I remember my first conference that I presented at. I remember this because this is my first webinar that I've ever done. And I think it's been over the course of really 5 years where I started taking art very seriously. And I did notice that once I, made very consistent work and started doing work for organizations like Amplifier, people feel really inspired to put out their own work when they see someone that's like them making it. And I have had people tell me that this is also what I want to do. How do I go about getting into this kind of field? How do I share my work with more people? And I do think that there's a really specific level of authenticity and transparency that's required when you're making really vulnerable work like this. Even the piece that I made for the Power to the Polls campaign, maybe some people would see it and then they would think it's very general and not specific and not personal. But it is actually very personal. I put a lot of myself into all of my work. And I hope people really feel that.
I definitely feel that. And your work is very powerful to me, and I really, really resonate with it. So thank you for sharing yourself with the world, and I hope that you feel inspired to create more pieces, and because you have a powerful message to share with the world.
Thank you. That means so much to me.
Awesome. So that is our webinar. Thank you for joining us and learning more about the Power to the Polls campaign. You can go to powertothepolls.com for access to all of the free downloadable art, and you can decorate your classrooms and your campuses and your homes and workspaces, learning spaces with this amazing art with these powerful messages. Thank you to Women's March, Rock the Vote, and Rochelle Duazo for sharing your wisdom and your experiences with us. If you haven't already, please register to be a part of our national network of educators by going to education.amplifier.org. Registration takes less than 5 minutes, and this summer we will be gearing up for another exciting school year that will include free artwork and opportunities to engage in storytelling. You can reach out to me at maribel@amplifier.org in the meantime, and I'm looking forward to spending the next school year supporting your efforts in creating inclusive, dialogue-rich learning spaces. Thank you and take care.